Okay, so first side note, I will try not to go with the fake English pronunciation because I am not an English speaker. So I will not say Enrico Fermi, but will try to go with the original. Have fun. In university, I once got a question on a test that went like this. First, calculate the area of some astronomical quantity, which was like a parsec squared or something, and then compare this area to the area of Austria. So I was born in Austria and I went to university in Austria, so it wasn't just any random country, it was my country that I was born and living in. But anyway, the question was calculate this area and compare it to the area of Austria. Which would have been simple enough if the area of Austria had been given in the test, which it wasn't. So it turns out that I was the only one in the entire class to get the question to answer right. And spoiler alert, it was not because I was such an ace in geography. Just like everybody else taking the test, I did not know the area of Austria. What I did know though is what a Fermi question is. So Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi was born in Italy and emigrated to the US in the 1930s. He was a nuclear scientist and was one of the most prominent figures in nuclear research, especially during the early times. So he was the one who built the first working nuclear reactor in the 1940s and then went on to join the Manhattan Project. Like maybe like many physicists, he was a bit of a special character. Maybe a bit too much to go into here, but one particular thing, he was famous for asking these difficult open questions. Maybe the most famous of these examples is that he was present at the Trinity test in '45 in Los Alamos. He estimated the yield of this bomb by throwing some pieces of paper in the air and then measuring how far they were moved by the blast wave, and then estimating that the yield must have been around 10 kilotons. Later they made a radiochemical analysis. After weeks they came up with the real yield, which was 21 kilotons, which was insanely close for considering this crude method, and he got to within 50% of the real solution. Some examples of Fermi quote. Fermi. So some examples of Fermi questions. How many piano tuners are there in the city of Chicago, which is the original Fermi questions in many ways. How many hairs? How many hairs are there on a human head? How many trees would we have to plant to completely offset our CO2 emissions? How often does a teenager say like in a week or a year? If all pickles sold last year were placed end to end together, would this cover the distance completely around the equator of the Earth? And note, apart from the question itself, there is no more information provided. All right. Probably nothing of this makes sense to you yet. Let's completely work through an example. Obviously the pickles question. If all pickles sold last year were placed end to end, would this cover the complete distance around the equator of the Earth? I'm going to use the EU here because I live there, but with the US, I guess you'll get a very similar figure. Apparently there are a lot of differences in pickle culture. There are pickles and there are gherkins and there are pickled gherkins, and I will be using something else again called cornichon, which is essentially small pickles. Starting with a single pickle, I would say that's a length of about 5 centimeters. That's close enough for our estimate. Next, how many pickles to a jar? Between 15 and 20. Let's go with 15-ish. We have 5 times 15 is 75 centimeters of length for all the pickles of this jar. 0.75 meters per jar. Nice. Next up, how many chars? This is certainly the one with the largest margin of error here. I will start with my own consumption. I'll eat 1 char in a month, so about 12 per year. We can round that down to 10. The difficult thing is to judge whether the average person in the EU will eat more or less than that. In my case, I would say I'm on the upper end of pickle consumption for the people I know. So I would have to go down with my estimate of 10 chars a year to maybe, let's say, 25%, 20%. So this would be around 2 chars per year. The EU has a population of around 500 million people, more or less. So we end up with 1 billion chars of pickle consumption in the entire EU in a year. So all we have to do now is take the length we get from 1 char and multiply it with the number of chars. We have 0.75 meters per char. We have 1 billion chars, so we have 0.75 billion meters, or put it more simply, 750,000 kilometers, which is way more than the distance around the equator, which is around 40,000 kilometers. So almost by a factor of 20. Even with all our uncertainties we had, we can say, yes, you will very likely cover the equator of the Earth. Now, having calculated that, let's look a bit more at our result and at the way we got there and what we can learn from that. First up, know stuff. If you want to calculate things like that, you just have to know some numbers. The population of some city or country, or length, like the distance around the Earth, or the distance from the Earth to the Moon, or from the Earth to the Sun. Next up, and that's important, how accurate is the number we calculated? As you remember, we did a lot of estimates along the way, especially in how much people eat pickles in a year, which are very rough. So in the end, you can easily come up with an error of around factor 10, sometimes more. In this particular example, we got a factor of 20, it should suffice. So even if we did a serious mistake, we would still be within our margin of error and our answer would still be correct. However, if the question would have been different, can you cover the distance from the Earth to the Moon with pickles? The distance from the Earth to the Moon is around 380,000 kilometers, which is around half of what we calculated. So a factor of 2 you can get wrong very easily. Technically, our result is bigger by a factor of 2. That's not really enough to say with confidence that this would actually work out. On the other hand, if the question had been, could we cover the distance from the Earth to the Sun, which is way higher, this is like about larger by a factor of more than 100. We can very reliably say, no, it would not work because we only got 1/100th of the way. And even taking all of our uncertainties into account, it is unlikely that they would add up to give that factor of 100. That shows in what way these answers can be useful. If you get a result that is clearly above or beyond a certain threshold, you're done, you're good. If you get a result that is too close to a certain threshold, this kind of estimate is not good enough and you will have to come up with something better. When calculating this example, I have deliberately chosen to not do something that you absolutely should do, which is calculating in powers of 10 and using the scientific notation. For the simple reason that I wanted to keep the numbers in a format that everybody understands. I will absolutely do another video about the scientific notation to explain it in more detail. And it is extremely useful and extremely powerful exactly for actually these kinds of calculations. One of the most infamous physics books in German is the Physik, which is named after its author, Christian Gerzen. This original book was then passed on to different authors after the original author had passed away. And they updated it and adapted it. Between 1970s and 2000, this task fell to a professor called Helmut Vogel. Very roughly, you could say that English counterparts are Halliday physics or Tipler physics, but only concerning scope, so only in the sense that they try to cover the entirety of physics as well, but they do it in a very beginner-friendly way. The Gerzen is not beginner-friendly. It's more written to refine your knowledge of physics, not to build it up. Especially the exercises after each chapter are absolutely legendary and are definitely the thing that defined this book in the Vogel era. It has changed since a bit. Some stuff was kept, but I think it has changed quite a bit, especially with the exercises, which I think is a shame because they were really special, but I do understand that for people trying to learn physics for the first time, these are awful. So the exercises, while some of the exercises are pretty standard, like in any other textbook that you can get, a lot of them are basically Fermi questions that cannot be calculated using basic math. Let me read you some examples. Length of day. Estimate by how much the following events have changed the length of a day on Earth. Building of the Chinese Wall. Saturation of the entire troposphere with water vapor. An ice age. Formation of the Himalayas. Underwater conversation. Why can't divers communicate underwater by speaking, considering the absorption of sound is so much smaller in water than in air? Why was it assumed for such a long time that all fish are mute? And why was that assumption corrected? Now, this type of exercise is very different from just giving people some numbers to put into a formula and be done with it. Actually, when I first read them in first semester, I can remember thinking that how can it even be possible to solve something like that? And towards the end of my studies, I was finally able to compute them and get the correct answer, at least for most of them. Unfortunately for my international audience, the Gerzen Physik has never been translated into other languages. There's only the German version, and even this is an outdated version by now because Helmut Vogel died in 2000. But if anybody knows any book like this in English, please let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested in that. Yes. The area calculation, the test, you didn't forget. Very good. The thing is that humans are really bad in estimating areas because areas mostly don't mean anything to us. Maybe you understand what a square meter is, and you understand how many square meters your house or your garden or your flat has, and that's absolutely it. What we're pretty good at estimating and what we're pretty good at understanding is distances. Especially when you travel and you drive from one city to another using the train or the car, then this means something to you. That's what I used. I knew that the east-west stretch of Austria is about 500 kilometers, give or take. And the north-south extension is a lot smaller. I did estimate it to be 200 kilometers. It's a bit more than that, but that was good enough. And in the end, this 500 times 200 gave us some area. It gave us the area of a rectangle. And I know roughly what shape Austria is. So I knew that I had to correct this by a factor, which I estimated to be about 1/3. So I took away 1/3 from the area that I got, which gave me a result of 66,000 square kilometers. It turns out that the correct area of Austria is about 84,000 kilometers. So I was off by just 25%, which is again pretty spectacular using some very, very basic method. Fermi questions are also used in job interviews right now, especially with tech companies like Google or Apple. Like for example, if you apply for a job at Airbus, they might ask you in the interview how many golf balls you can fit into an A380. Whatever, if you apply at Boeing, they can ask you the same with a 747. And if you haven't come across the concept of a Fermi question, what it is and what it means and how it can be solved, this sounds like absolute bullshit to you. The point, of course, with the Fermi questions in a job interview is exactly that, to surprise the candidate and see how he can think on his feet and how he can do some rough estimates and calculations and see his mind at work. So it's not really important at what number you arrive in the end. It's more important that you understand what kind of path you can follow to get at an answer, which is a pretty decent answer, even if it's off by 25 or 50 or 70%. These kinds of questions, as I've said, have always had a certain fascination with me, because I found it absolutely surreal that you can get to an answer starting from almost nothing. And I think the main takeaway from this video is that once you have seen that such questions can be answered and how you go about doing that, you have a new mental tool at your disposal. You see, the reason why I was the only one who could solve the test question wasn't because I was so much smarter than everybody else, but because I had this additional tool at my disposal, because I had learned, I had seen how these things can be tackled. The same goes for job interviews. If a candidate is confronted with a question like this and does not know how to answer it and how to go about answering it, he can completely collapse or black out or not even know where to start. But if you do know how to go about answering these questions, you absolutely can arrive at a solution, even if it's off by a factor of 10, but that's still a lot better than having nothing or having a wild guess which is off by a factor of 1,000 or 1,000,000, because it's anything really. It's just one of those things. If you know, you know. And now, you know.